It's fascinating to see the microcosm of the EU and how it goes about implementing some of the reforms that have been agreed at the global level. I'll focus my remarks today on the work of the FSB to analyze and monitor the implementation and effects of reforms. It's obviously of relevance, some relevance for the European discussion. I'll go through the PowerPoint presentation, which you may have in front of you fairly quickly, and I'll certainly be welcome to take questions later. First two slides of the PowerPoint presentation are more of a background, thank you, about what the FSB is about, in case some of the participants here are not very well aware of it, but the FSB was converted into its present structure back in 2009 in the aftermath of the crisis. It's chaired by the Governor of the Bank of England. The Secretariat, of which I'm a member, is hosted by the Bank for International Settlements in Basel. And the representation, and I think it's one of the distinguishing features of the FSB, is 24 member jurisdictions, including 6 from the EU, the ECB, and the European Commission, all of the international standard-setting bodies, and the international financial institutions. We also have launched over the last couple of years regional consultative groups to reach out to another 65 jurisdictions around the world. I think 3 things distinguish the FSB from other international bodies. One is broad representation. It brings together ministries of finance, central banks, and regulatory bodies. Number 2 is the link to the G20. That we have a direct link to the G20. We have a mandate to report, to coordinate on behalf of the G20 and report to the G20 on progress with the financial regulatory reform agenda. And number 3, we work through our members. We're not an international body in the sense of the IMF and the World Bank. We don't have large numbers of staff. The Secretariat is about 30-odd people, and the work is being done by our members. So what we have helped to do over the last few years is to develop international financial standards. Those are minimum standards. Countries, and this is soft law, the countries that sat at the table, made those commitments, are the ones that have been called upon to implement. They get to decide how to go about implementation. Our job, among other things, is to monitor the implementation and report it back to the G20. Now, why do we need the reforms? Maybe we should remind ourselves a little bit why we did this. I mean, the memories of the crisis are fading away, and it's important to keep in mind that the reform program that we've started is only halfway through its implementation. In certain key areas, and some of them were mentioned by previous speakers, shadow banking, we've only recently begun. In others, implementation is more advanced, such as in the case of Basel III. So there were tremendous costs coming out of the crisis in terms of fiscal costs, budget costs, employment, growth, and the global economy, and especially advanced economies, including Europe, are still recovering from the effects of the crisis. The G20 reform agenda has 4 main planks. The first is to make financial institutions more resilient, and this is mainly about Basel III and implementation of what is in Europe called the CRD4, as well as reforms to compensation practices to align incentives. The second main plank is ending too big to fail. This is about identifying systemically important financial institutions and introducing additional requirements for them in terms of higher capital, more strict supervision, and resolution-related requirements, so that the impact from the failure of those institutions does not create real big problems to the economy. The third plank is about making derivatives markets safer. There's a whole host of reforms there relating to clearing of over-the-counter derivatives products, reporting of transactions to be able to, for regulators to see what the risks are, to take appropriate actions. And finally, it's about transforming shadow banking into resilient market-based finance and strengthening the oversight and regulation of that type of finance. So the reforms, in our mind, support strong, sustainable growth. There is no fundamental trade-off between financial stability and economic growth. They are mutually supportive. You can look at it both ways, financial stability supporting economic growth, and as Commissioner Hale has said more recently, economic growth supporting financial stability. Now, we didn't do these reforms. I mean, the reforms were done in a hurry, but it's not as if we didn't look into their effects. There have been a number of major ex-ante impact assessment studies and that were done for a number of these reforms. We had studies done on the impact of Basel III, capital and liquidity requirements. We had studies done for the impact of introducing higher capital requirements for systemically important banks, and also for all the counter reforms. I've provided you in the last page of the presentation with web links to those studies. Those studies have all shown that the benefits exceed the costs by a significant margin. There is a moderate impact in some cases on lending volumes and prices, but this is more than outweighed by the reduction in the likelihood and severity of future crises and the associated costs to the economy. And the results are confirmed by studies done by other international bodies, the IMF, the OECD, etc. It's fair to say the industry has put out some of its own studies. It's fair to say that so far the results of the official studies tend to be confirmed. But of course, it's all part of the discussion about the effects of reforms, and I'll come to that in a second. So one of the FSB's objectives or mandate is to promote implementation through monitoring, peer review, and disclosure, and this is indeed the main function of the committee that I support, the SCSI, the Standing Committee on Standards Implementation. And indeed, I would say this is one of the main distinguishing features of the international work prior to the crisis compared to now. Prior to the crisis, there was a very simple setup. Standard-setting bodies put out some rules. National authorities decide whether to implement them. There is no follow-up, no monitoring whether those reforms have been introduced or not. And it was up to the IMF and the World Bank to assess the consistency or the compliance with the standard. Nowadays, it's a much more complicated world. The international standard-setting bodies have a mandate to also monitor the implementation of their own standards, and the FSB is there to coordinate among the various standard setters and report that to the G20. Our focus is on some of the priority areas that you see in the presentation, and we coordinate that work with the standard-setting bodies, and we report on it annually. There are assigned task groups that do this and publish reports every year. The focus until recently has been on the timeliness of implementation. Have the jurisdictions implemented the reforms in accordance with their international commitments? Over time, we're focusing from the timeliness to the consistency of implementation. Have the reforms been introduced? Are the national rules consistent with international standards? And then moving from timeliness to consistency, the next obvious step is effectiveness. Are the reforms achieving their intended outcomes? So in that sense, what the purpose of this discussion today is very relevant for our own work as well. We published a so-called dashboard last year on implementation, where things stand. This is an extract from it. It was appended to our chair's letter to the G20. This year, we're going to publish a much more comprehensive report to the G20 on implementation and effects of reforms. And we are going to start using some of the information we collect from our members. And we think that monitoring the effects is good regulatory practice. It's part of our accountability. And indeed, our objective as well is to evaluate whether the reforms are achieving their intended outcomes. If there are unintended consequences that are major, we need to find ways to identify and address them. We're using two main approaches to coming up with an assessment of the effects of reforms, a bottom-up and a top-down. What do I mean by that? The bottom-up one is reform-specific. So within the ambit of Basel III, within the ambit of OTC reforms, within the ambit of compensation, we're trying to see whether the individual reforms introduced for each of these sectors or areas are achieving their intended outcomes. And we're working with the relevant monitoring body to develop indicators to find out what the effects have been. So this is a bottom-up approach. It's sector-specific, it's reform-specific. And then you have the top-down approach. And the top-down approach is about the combined effects of reforms. And so an example of the kind of analysis that would be a top-down approach for us is what the European Commission is trying to collect evidence on, which is whether the reforms in their entirety put together are achieving their intended effects. And we're trying to use both of those approaches together, relying on work done by the FSB itself and our members, as well as input from relevant stakeholders. So we are going to be encouraging more work in the future in this